So, okay, Jan, take it away.
Yes. Hi, everybody. Since my name isn't on our camera, I'm Jan Demarest. And since Leslie had to be gone, she asked me if I would introduce Brian. And so I've been reading about you, Brian, and other folks have too, but I'll just briefly review. The program is about the cougar and human interface, where the urban areas have started to push up against the cougar's wild habitat. And Brian's going to talk about that and also a lot about cougars themselves. Brian is a wildlife research scientist with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. He's responsible for conducting carnivore investigations. In his role as the agency's principal carnivore researcher, Brian has led studies of cougar wildland urban ecology in Western Washington and the predator-prey dynamics of cougars, wolves, and their ungulate prey, which would be deer and elk, in managed landscapes of eastern Washington. Prior to joining WDFW, Brian researched the predator-prey dynamics of wolves and elk in Idaho as the senior wildlife research biologist for the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and cougar wildland urban ecology in Washington as a postdoc researcher with the University of Washington. Brian has more than 20 years of cougar field research experience, holds BS, MS, and PhD degrees in forest resources, wildlife science from the UW, where he is also an affiliate assistant professor in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences, working with graduate students on a variety of carnivore research projects throughout Washington. So, take it away, Brian. Great to have you.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jan. I hope you are all sufficiently impressed. That's all that is intended to do there, is to impress you. So first of all, I want to thank the Kittitas Audubon Society for hosting me tonight. One of the projects that I worked on that I didn't have there in my bio is actually I was one of the graduate students that worked on Project Cougars and Teaching in the Cle area in the Upper Valley. So I have some local familiarity, some local experience with your neck of the woods, and I would certainly say I have quite a bit of affinity for that area. It's the Upper County and even the Lower County. I didn't spend as much time there in my work. It's a beautiful place. I spend quite a bit of time. I live on the other side of the hill, but I do make it over quite frequently. So my plan for tonight is just to kind of give you guys a crash course in what I call cougar wildland urban ecology. So a little bit when they're in the backcountry wildlands, a little bit when they're in the front country backyards, and just all the different things they do and what we know about them. And really what I hope to impress upon you tonight is just how remarkably adaptable these animals are, and also give you some tips for avoiding conflicts and what you can do in the event that you actually interact with a cougar, you actually bump into a cougar, that sort of thing. So I have a tendency, you don't have to twist my arm to talk cats, so I can go and go and go. I'll do my best not to do that tonight, because I also want to leave ample opportunity to answer folks' questions, hear your stories, all that good stuff. So let's see here if I can dive right in and share my screen, and we will take off here. Can you guys see that so far? All right, cool. We'll go into present mode. I will confess I'm a little less, I don't spend as much time working with Zoom as I do with Teams for the department. We're kind of a Teams platform, but let's hope at least one of those degrees I have can get me through this. So, all right, well, let's get started here. So I've always really liked this title because, again, it sort of captures this full suite of cougars in these sort of complex dynamic landscapes that we have here in Western Washington, all of Washington, and really throughout the West. And again, this is just me trying to prove my street cred that I do, in fact, have quite a bit of experience working with these animals. I've led a number of studies. I've worked on a number of studies over the past 20 years. They're very, very challenging, both in terms of the science and the animal to study, as well as the sort of the politics and the sort of human dynamics in the system as well. So now I always like to start off with this slide. This is probably one that folks are familiar with. This is NASA's image of Earth at night. And I like this image because what it does is it really gets right to the heart of the matter. And that is this extensive human presence that exists across the globe. Human beings are pretty ubiquitous everywhere. I suppose if you're looking for a little alone time, Antarctica still looks pretty good. That's this big mass here, on the lower end of your picture. But really, if you look at our neck of the woods in the United States, there's pretty much people everywhere. Now, fortunately for cougars, they are arguably the most successful and adaptive large carnivore on the planet. If they're not the most, they're certainly one of the most. And this is a depiction of their current and historic range map. So essentially all of those areas in green are places that have extant cougar populations. And really, the cougar is thought to have the largest geographic distribution of any terrestrial mammal in the Western Hemisphere. Essentially northern British Columbia all the way south to the very southern tip of South America into Patagonia. And really, even historically, it was from the Pacific coast throughout the North and South American continent to the Atlantic coast in the North and South American continent. And really that speaks to their adaptability. Now, here in Washington, we have approximately 104,000 square kilometers of suitable cougar habitat. Those are those areas in light green. If you're not a big fan of the metric system, one, shame on you. Two, that's about 41,000 square miles, 40 to 41,000. So lots of cougar habitat. If you're familiar at all with Washington, and I'm assuming you are, you'll notice that this is pretty consistent with forested habitat here in the state. Some of those black areas in the Cascades and out on the Olympic Peninsula, those tend to be high elevation, rocky kind of country, stuff above 6,500, 7,000 feet. And then obviously a good portion of the Columbia Basin Plateau isn't necessarily cougar habitat. But what we found from a lot of research is, in fact, there's actually a little more cougar habitat out there than we thought there was 20 years ago. Now, here in Washington, we do have cougars, and we have what we consider to be a healthy population. We have a total population that's somewhere in the range, and this is really my estimate. This is not an official department estimate. This is kind of based on what I know and my experience with populations. And we've probably got somewhere in the realm of 3,000 to 4,000 total cougars. Sometimes you'll see a population estimate that lists it as 18 to 2,200. That's what we consider the independent aged animals that are 18 months and older. There's very specific reason that the department uses that estimate, and that's what we base our harvest thresholds, our harvest guidelines, because cougars are a game species in Washington. You can legally hunt them if you have a big game license and a cougar tag. And ultimately, Washington's cougar management is driven by 5 overarching principles that I've got listed there. Really pretty basic stuff. First and foremost, we want to maintain viable, stable populations. This is basically saying we want to make sure that we always have cougars well into the future, forever and ever. Recreation is to provide hunting opportunities. Next one, ensure public safety. We're going to talk a little bit about that. That public safety also includes minimizing property damage, depredations to livestock and pets. Depredations don't always equal public safety issues. And that's kind of one of those things that a lot of folks don't necessarily understand, but it's one that I always try to reiterate. The aesthetic cultural value, that one's a little more, the way I like to describe this is some people just like knowing that they have cougars out there. They may not care to ever bump into one. They may not have any interest to hunt one, but they do just like that they're out there, that they live in a state where we have this sort of, charismatic megafauna rolling the landscape. And then the last one is sort of a new addition with the recent game management plan. And this is, considering cougar roles in predator-prey relationships, specifically their impacts on ungulate populations, deer and elk primarily. Now, Washington is a really interesting place to be. And it's an interesting place to be because we don't only have cougars. We, in fact, are one of only 4 states in the lower 48 that has a full suite of large carnivores. Of course, the other 3 states would be Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Now, where it gets really interesting is Washington is the smallest Western state, but has the 2nd highest human population. And in fact, our human population is more than 2 to 2.5 times larger than the combined population of Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. Sort of diving a little deeper into that. And so when we think about Washington and its people, first thing you have to acknowledge is that Washington's human population is growing rapid. In fact, it's grown by more than 50% since 1990. We currently have about 7.6 million people, and it's projected to be 8.4 million people by 2030. In fact, I'd need to check those projections again. It might even be more than that if I look at it today. And what this sort of equates to is a loss of habitat. Now, not all of that habitat that's lost to people is necessarily cougar habitat, but a good portion of it can be. And what that also means is as you sort of constrain wildland habitats with this increasing footprint with people, is you run into this situation where you increase the proximity between cougars and people. And in some cases, as I'll show you, the actual spatial and temporal overlap of them. And that, as you can imagine, creates a number of challenges. And first and foremost of those is minimizing cougar-human interactions. And we have 4 sort of broad categories of cougar-human interactions. First one, just a sighting. Now, sightings, you could see a cougar may not see you. It could be far away, it could be close. These don't really equate to any sort of public safety risk or anything like that. Often they're sort of chance encounters. Next one would be an actual encounter. Encounters, the difference between an encounter and a sighting is proximity. Encounters are much closer. And typically the human presence and the recognition of human presence elicits a behavioral response from the cougar. More often than not, it's fleeing by them. Another type of interaction is, in fact, depredations. That can be domestic livestock or pets. Mostly the big 3 here in Washington tend to be, well, big 4 actually: goats, sheep, llamas, alpacas. It can involve other things like domestic cats, domestic dogs on occasion. Cattle are extremely rare. It's almost always calves. I actually, in my experience, and I could be wrong, I don't think I've ever seen evidence or reports of adult cows being killed by cats. But again, we'll talk about this a little later. They're pretty adaptable, so lots of things can happen. And then, of course, the last type of encounter, or excuse me, the last type of interaction and the most serious one would be an attack. And that's where there's actually like physical contact between a cougar and a person. And over the last 125 years of documented record keeping, there's been 21 cougar attacks of people in Washington state, of which 2 were fatal. We had the most recent one back in 2018 near North Bend. And then you have to go all the way back to 1924 for a boy in Okanagan County. So very, very rare. Now, one of the things you're going to hear me talk a lot about tonight is this wildland urban interface, and sort of conceptually what that is. And really, I like to show it first, because when you see it, it kind of makes sense. So that red line is the wildland urban interface here in King County, outside of Snoqualmie and North Bend. This was where I conducted 2 different cougar studies over a decade. And basically what you can sort of think about is the wildland urban interface is where open space, undeveloped, wild habitat. Now, it may have an extensive human presence in the form of, logging, recreation, things of that nature, but there's not actual like building of houses and infrastructure. There's really no residential presence. And then on the other side of the line is a pretty extensive human presence with residential development. Now, a lot of what I'm gonna sort of share with you tonight is a reflection of a lot of research, both research that I've done, my colleagues within the agency have done, and then of course our university collaborators. And we're pretty fortunate here in Washington. We, over the last 20 years, have invested a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into sort of understanding various aspects of cougar ecology and behavior. And these are the various places that we've studied cougars here in Washington. One thing I would note is that currently there is a large cougar project going on out on the Olympic Peninsula, because you're kind of like, wow, geez, boy, there's a real north central, northeast flare, a little bit here in the Cascades. But what's going on out here? Right now, there's a non-government organization known as Panthera, and a researcher by the name of Mark Elbrock, who's partnered with a number of the tribes out on the peninsula to conduct a cougar study out there. It's going on right now. Looking forward to seeing the results. It should fill in an important information gap here in Washington. But nonetheless, even without that, I think over the course of the 20 years, the last number I saw is we have captured and outfitted more than 350 individual cougars with radio collars, or mostly GPS radio collars. So lots and lots of information, lots of data, lots of publications. Just give you an idea of some of the different things we've talked about or really focused on. And really, this is more my work. This is the kind of stuff that my work has been focused on. Some of the other university projects and stuff have delved into other topics, but I'd like to think, pretty diverse there. A lot of my work is very much spatial in its orientation. I've been doing more population based work. I'm more of a visual space guy. That comes to me a little more naturally than the population stuff. There's a lot of math in population ecology. I'm not going to lie to you. There's a lot of math. All right, so let's get into sort of the nitty gritty of how these guys operate. And the place that I like to start to kind of explain this is this sort of unique social structure, social organization that cougars have. And really what this is sort of the unwritten rules that cougars function under, how they interact with each other, sort of the rules of cougar society, if you want to think about that. And really this is the big driver of so much of what they do. And it's very, very different between males and females. So the easiest way to sort of think about this is males are territorial. They establish and defend semi-exclusive territories to maintain direct access to as many females as possible. Now, they'll defend that territory against other males. It's not entirely exclusive. There is some overlap. There's some nuance and complexity there that, if you're interested, we could talk about it more later. But really, they're big areas. 600 square kilometers, about 175 square miles is the average for a male home range in Washington. And again, it's driven by access to females. Females are different. Females are driven almost entirely by access to prey to support their offspring. Their home ranges are much, much smaller. They have much, much more overlap. And I think the easiest way to sort of think about this is just to show you. So this is from my study here along the western foothills of the Cascades, just to kind of orient yourself. I'm not sure, I'm hoping you guys can see my cursor here when I move it. If not, try to visualize it. But obviously there's Lake Sammamish, Lake Washington, Snoqualmie Valley, Highway 2, I-90 comes through here, middle fork of the Snoqualmie. Hopefully that gives you an idea. But here, these are each one of those polygons, those sort of odd shaped polygons represents a female home range in the year 2014 as part of a recent cougar project. And so you can see, again, a lot of females, quite a bit of overlap. Still good sized territory, 65 square miles is nothing to shake a stick at. However, compare that to males. These were the two resident adult males in that same area. Now, these guys actually had a lot of overlap. And what was interesting about that is they were both old males. And they had likely been the territorial residents for quite some time. And so there is some evidence to suggest that sort of, they say familiarity breeds contempt. In the case of the cougar population, sometimes knowing who your neighbor is and sort of having established, boundaries, you can make it work. What's interesting is they were rarely, if ever, in the same place at the same time. So when the red guy was, who was M5, was at sort of the southern end of his territory, the other male, M9, would be, at the northern end of M5's territory. So they'd always sort of play this game. When one went north, the other one sort of followed him north. When one went south, the other sort of followed him south. But, again, a little bit of a mutual avoidance. Fights between resident males are not terribly common. Fights between resident males and transients, very common. And so within this unique social structure, this is a part it gets a little bit complicated, but it's still kind of worth explaining a little bit. Cougar populations are comprised of two very distinct segments: residents and transients. And residents are ones that have established home ranges. Residents are not. Transients are not. And transients, they might be present in an area for 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. If they're able to usurp the resident male, they may become the resident themselves, or they might move on someplace else. They tend to be young animals or very, very old animals that were usurped by a more dominant male. Females typically are only transient up until about 2.5 years. And then they tend to get recruited into either the local population or a different population if they dispersed. But you don't see old female transients. You only see old male transients. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how sort of that spatial organization, manifests within this sort of this complex wildland urban environment. I like showing this figure because basically what you're looking at here is a 3-dimensional depiction of a cougar home range. So those high peaks, the red ones, those are areas that this particular cougar used a lot. The areas in blue are ones within this cougar's home range, but that was used much less intensively than those warmer colors that you see. The yellow line is the wildland urban interface. The black dots are houses. And so this lines up actually quite a bit with that earlier figure. Again, to orient yourself, Fall City is about right in here, Carnation, Duval, up into Monroe, Highway 2 running here. And this was a single adult male. Now, the one thing to understand about use of residential areas for cougars in these type of landscapes is that it's very common. In fact, about 85% of the animals that I studied use these residential areas at least once. That is, they cross the yellow line into this area here at least once in their lifetime. The average cougar along the western slope of the Cascade Mountains spends about 16% of its time within areas with some level of residential development. However, it's really variable. Some animals don't use it at all. Almost always those are adult females. Some animals use it a lot. Those are also adult females. So here's kind of the fun thing to think about. Because males encompass such a huge area, it's hard for them to not bump into people. When you've got a 175 square mile home range in Western Washington along the western slope of the Cascades, some amount of that home range is going to be residential development. However, they don't actually use it all that much. Females, on the other hand, it's sort of all or none because they have these smaller home ranges that are situated away from the wildland urban interface. They never really roam far enough to bump into people. But then the females that have home ranges established at or near the wildland urban interface use residential areas a lot, like 30 to 40% of the time. There's some reasons for that I'll get into. But the way that I like to think about this is people are always asking why are cougars in these landscapes? Pretty simple answer. There's habitat and there's prey that they can exploit. And really, given how adaptable cougars are, again, remember, Patagonia, northern BC, you drop a couple of houses into their home range, they can roll with that. This is just sort of a depiction of each one of these yellow dots represents a GPS location from a collared cougar. In this case, this was an adult female that I tracked for 3 years. This is pretty typical. Like most of the use of these residential areas occurred, right at that wildland urban interface. However, you do have individuals like this. This was a transient subadult male. This is Snoqualmie, the Snoqualmie Ridge development, if you're being more specific here. That's a pretty, that's a landscape that has a pretty extensive human footprint. However, if you look closely, you'll once again notice this using suitable habitat within the matrix. He's not in here, just FYI, if you want to swing by, I live right here. The KAS Kertson is here. This is where I live. This was like my favorite cat to track ever because I could just like go out in the driveway, open the truck door, turn on the radio and be like, oh, okay, I hear him. He's around. But anyway, what you can see here is, again, he's using this wildland-like habitat, that's interdispersed and around the residential development. When cats do go into actual residential development, which they do sometimes, it's not terribly common, it's almost always at night, like between 10 and 2 in the morning kind of thing. This is an adult female, and I like this image because in a moment here, it's going to really kind of tell that story. Remember I talked about, suitable habitat and prey that can be exploited. Well, this really captures it. So the nice thing about these GPS collars is when a cougar kills a deer or an elk or something, they hang out. They hang out from anywhere from 12 to 24 to 10 days, depending upon how big it is. And these GPS collars, in my case, we're taking a location, taking a fix every 4 hours. And so those dots stack up and they're not moving. And you can then go into those locations and figure out, after they've left, what they were doing, or usually like, what did they kill? How much of it did they eat? That sort of thing. And so each one of those circles represents a deer that this particular female had killed and fed on. Now, where it gets really interesting is you'll see that huge cluster right there. That was actually a den site. And so she actually dropped her kittens right there and spent upwards of about 6. When cougars have offspring, that great big, huge 65 square mile home range becomes about 1 mile to 2 miles square because they keep returning to the den. They're hunting, feeding, they come back and nurse, then they go feed, up until those kittens become more mobile. Just to kind of give you an idea, cougars don't put den sites in places devoid of prey. They're not stupid. Mom sets up shop as close to the supermarket as she can. And so this really sort of captures that dynamic of trying to exploit prey in a really, really suitable landscape. Residential, these wildland urban landscapes, they don't represent unsuitable habitat. They represent modified habitat. It's not ideal, because I don't want to give you the impression that cougars are sort of seeking out people in development. There's sort of a threshold where there's enough suitable habitat and few enough people to not deter cougars. But once you sort of get past a threshold in terms of the number of people, cougar use drops off precipitously. And in fact, we've actually quantified what that level is in different landscapes in Washington. This figure captures that quantification. And really the take home here, I don't have a lot of figures in here, is what you'll notice is the shape. Is basically, so you've got 4 different study areas, my Western Washington study areas, the Northeast, which is area around Kettle Falls, Okanagan, centered on the Medhow Valley, and then Cleelum, your neck of the woods, Upper County. So there's sort of different thresholds where cougars drop out of the system in terms of that x-axis here is how many houses per 100 square kilometer, or excuse me, per square kilometer, not 100 square. So like right here is 500 houses per kilometer. And what you see is by that point, cougars, they're pretty much out of the mix. But they're all responding the same way, that as residential development increases, cougar presence in those landscapes decrease. Those are the actual numbers. All right, let's transition a little bit. I've already sort of tipped my hand a little bit here in terms of the role of predation and prey and things like that. And so when we're talking about cougars, what we're really talking about is ungulates, large body prey, here in Washington and throughout most of North America, Western North America, I should be more specific. We're talking about deer species, white-tailed deer, mule deer, and black-tailed deer. And then of course, elk. Really cougar distribution, if I put that range map up, it really coincides with this large bodied ungulate prey. That's really sort of what drives them. However, as I've alluded to, these animals are incredibly opportunistic and adaptable. They'll take prey as small as the lagomorphs, snowshoe hares, eastern cottontails, stuff like that, to as large as cow moose. So really pretty remarkable. In fact, cougars kill the largest prey relative to their own body size, their body mass, of any of the big cats. So it's not unusual for a 90 to 100 pound female. She's fully capable of taking down a 300 pound cow elk. A big male, 150 plus pounds, they're fully capable of, taking down a 500 pound bull elk. And so again, this just tremendous flexibility. I talked a little bit before that cougars do from time to time eat domestic animals. However, it's really pretty uncommon. In the studies that have been done, cougars, as best we could tell, and this is probably an overestimate, their diet, 2 to 3% of their diet at most represents domestic animals. And really, that's not across the board. That's, some individuals do it more than others. Some may never do it. In fact, most never do it at all. But either way, even in these wildland urban landscapes, it's not a common phenomenon. I get this question a lot. How many deer do they eat? Like, it's a 50, and everyone sort of heard that number, like 1 deer per week. Like, and then they start doing math. It's the only time anybody ever likes doing math. It's like, oh, 1 deer a week, so 52 deer a year, and there's 30 deer, and so on and so forth. The way that I like to think about it is, in general, on average, cougars eat the energetic equivalent of a deer a week. Not a deer a week, the energetic equivalent. And there's lots of ways to get to the energetic equivalent of 1 deer. However, how they do this, it really varies quite a bit. Cougar diet, more often than not, is sort of a reflection of what's out there on the landscape. If you're in a landscape, like, so for example, in Upper Kittitas, where you have both mule deer and a elk population, the diet was both mule deer and elk. In my neck of the woods, on the other side of the hill, we have elk, but they occur, there's many fewer of them than you do have in sort of the Yakima and the Clockham herds. So elk wasn't uncommon. The diet over here was much more black-tailed deer specific. Although we did have an occasional mountain goat. There's a remnant population of mountain goats that runs along kind of the Mount Si, Mount Tenerife into the Middle Fork and up to South Fork and stuff. But again, bottom line, it's a reflection of sort of what's out there on the landscape. There are big sex differences. I alluded to this earlier. Larger cougars can kill larger prey. So one of the papers that was published out of Project Cat in the Cleelum area showed that males, their diet had a much larger proportion of elk in it than females. Female diet was much larger proportion of mule deer. And again, that's just sort of the mechanics of bigger cats can kill bigger things. When I mentioned earlier that cougars can kill prey as large as cow moose, that's males. And those are big males doing that. The other key factor is the reproductive status. So females are supporting offspring, sometimes 1 to 3, and in very rare cases 4 offspring up to a year and a half of their life. And so females with offspring, as those offspring get bigger, their kill rate gets higher because they gotta kill more things to feed those offspring. So again, as in with a lot of things in nature, it gets pretty complicated pretty fast. This is just another kind of hammering home sort of that diversity. This was some work that I did here in Western Washington, sort of showing cougar diets in this wildland urban landscape. And so this dark green here again, vast majority black-tailed deer, a little bit of elk, a little bit of unknown. The one that was kind of interesting is you'll see this blue one here. Beavers, poor beavers. I just sort of think of beavers as sort of like the milk dud of cougar diet. They're just squishy and soft, and I don't know if you guys realize this, but beavers can get huge. I mean, it's not unusual in Western Washington to have a 40 to 50 pound beaver, and they're fat laden. They're just little calorie bombs, and beavers spend an extraordinary amount of time on land. They're not always in the water, and these cats would hunt these beavers up and down the many sort of riparian corridors that existed here in the study area and stuff. And so that was kind of an interesting finding. This isn't one I don't think this has like great management implications. It's just kind of interesting. This is some results from another study, and this is just all I'm trying to show you here is how that proportion of cougar diet changes as cats move through this wildland urban landscape. So 3 different categories. First one, synanthropes. Those are species those are sort of the species that do well near people. Think raccoons, coyotes, possums, things like that. We lumped domestic species into this analysis in that category, even though technically they're not, but you get the idea. Ungulates and then rodents, that's your beavers, and our good friend Aplodontia rufa, the mountain beaver. I don't know how familiar you guys are with mountain beavers, but here in Western Washington, they're a very primitive, and by primitive I mean sort of evolutionarily. They have a body style that's been around for a very long time. They're endemic to Western Washington. They're also super cute. I know I'm a scientist, I'm not supposed to say stuff like that, but they're super cute. But anyway, cougars do get into those colonies and dig them up and eat them. But bottom line is this, as the building density increases on the landscape, as you get sort of more development and more of those synanthropic species, higher proportion of cougar diet. Ungulates, interestingly, ungulates within the developed portion of the landscape are kind of sitting ducks. And so as you see residential development go up, you actually see more, you see more deer in the diet as well. And what those two species are really replacing are beavers. And that's what you see in that sort of that declining graph in the C panel there. But again, speaks to their adaptability. I hear from folks all the time, I think I saw a cougar kill last weekend. And I say, okay, what did it look like? And they're like, well, the head was over here and the rib cage was over there. And then I found the legs like 50 feet away. That may have been a cougar kill, but what they're describing is either it was heavily scavenged or more likely than not, it was something different. So cougars do what we call caching, which is sort of nature's refrigerator. They actually, after they kill a deer, first thing they do is they eat the heart, the liver, and the lungs. The heart is really important. Cougars cannot synthesize their own vitamin A, and so that's where they get it. And then, of course, the liver and the lungs, those internal organs are incredibly nutritious. And then they'll move into the muscle mass. But in between feedings, remember those stacked up dots I showed you on the map, they actually cover the prey up with whatever. And so these are two examples. The upper example is sort of a typical interior forest cache where there's lots of vegetation and things that they can pile on top. If you look closely, you'll see a leg sticking out here. You'll see a foot sticking out here. If you pull all that off, there's a full-size deer under there. This is what happens when they kill a deer in a place that doesn't have a lot to cover it up with. In this case, this cat just sort of drug some sticks on it, threw some dirt on it, and called it good. Think of caching as nature's refrigerator. It helps to slow the rate of decomposition, and it also helps to hide your food from people that would steal it from you. Bears, bobcats, coyotes, turkey vultures, eagles, spotted skunks, you name it, right? This kind of gives you an idea here. Let's see if I can play this. So that's obviously a deer there. And you can, as this cat's kind of pulling that deer out of the cache, you see all sort of the sword ferns and stuff fly off, and they kind of clear that away, and then they get to work eating it. All right, let's change gears a little bit here. Start talking a little bit about competition, because competition is a pretty important force in nature. And people, with the reemergence of wolf populations on the landscape, people have lots of questions about how cougars respond to wolves, how wolves and cougars interact. They're both apex predators. Of course, cougars, have been interacting with black bears here in Washington for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about that. So first of all, just sort of a key driver here. And within the world of competition, there's really two types. There's intraspecific and interspecific. Pretty straightforward. Intraspecific is sort of cougars competing with other cougars. Interspecific would be cougars competing with other carnivores, other species. Without fail, within nature, intraspecific, so animals competing with members of their own species, is the fundamental driving force in terms of competitive influences. That's not to say that interspecific competition isn't important. It's just not as important as it is within the species itself. And again, I sort of mentioned this earlier, the two big interspecific competitors for cougars are bears and wolves. Now, where grizzly bears are more abundant, we have grizzly bears in Washington, but there's a good chance that I could lose a couple of my fingers in a terrible firework accident, and I'd still have enough to count probably how many grizzly bears we have here in Washington. We don't have a good feel for that, but it's not a lot. We do have a pretty good population of black bears throughout the state, readily, competing with cougars. And of course, we now have this emerging wolf population, which is from a scientific standpoint, has been really exciting to sort of watch that unfold. And the project that we just finished field work on was very much focusing on how cougars are responding to wolves. One of the things I want to emphasize is that overlap is pretty common in terms of spatial overlap. There is what we call niche partitioning, where basically everybody retreats to the place on the landscape where they do things best. And in the case of cougars and wolves, so cougars are a stalking predator. They have to approach their prey unseen, undetected before they launch their assault at a very, very close distance. Wolves are a coursing predator. They run their prey down over long distances typically. Stalking predators, the condition of the prey typically doesn't matter. It's all about where you are. You could have the healthiest deer in the forest, but if they're in the wrong place in the wrong time, there's not a lot they can do if there's a cat there. Wolves, on the other hand, are the ones that you sort of think about, taking the weak, the sick, the old, and that's a reflection of sort of that coursing where it's an extended hunt over a long distance. And with that sort of comes different parts of the landscape that are more advantageous. So for cougars, densely vegetated, rugged terrain, that favors a stalking predator. Where typically for a wolf, coursing predators, it's more gentle, open terrain is more favorable for their hunting style. What research is starting to show, though, is there's a little less spatial differentiation, spatial partitioning, and it's more temporal. With wolves sort of own the day and cats sort of own the night. Cougars are considered subordinate competitors to bears and wolves. Now, cougars do kill bears and wolves. And in fact, one of the leading sources of mortality that we've seen with our collared wolves, at least natural mortality, non-human related mortality, is cougars. We've had a number of collared wolves that have been killed by cougars. But the subordinate comes from if a cougar encounters a bear or a wolf at a kill site, or I should say a pack of wolves, they'll abandon that kill site to the bear or to the pack of wolves. And so that's why they're sort of considered subordinate. Additionally, cougars typically sort of restrict where they're found on the landscape when wolves show up. A lot of this is new, sort of emerging science. We're still sort of figuring it out. Some of it does appear to be sort of situation specific, but in general, that's pretty much how it works. This is kind of gives you an idea. So again, these are GPS. So the yellow kitties, that's an adult male cougar. The red, that is a wolf pack. And again, these are GPS. So the each yellow cougar is a single GPS fix. Each red wolf is a single GPS fix from that collared wolf that represents a pack of wolves. And so that cluster of cougar locations was this adult male killed a moose calf over in Northeast Washington, was happily feeding on it until the Carpenter Ridge pack showed up. And the next, so basically there was one of these locations was like, the last one was like 10 in the morning. The fix from 2 in the afternoon, 4 hours later, he was 5 miles away. And you would run 5 miles away too if 10 wolves showed up to where you had just, had been hanging out, feeding on the moose calf or the moose yearling that you had killed. This kind of gives you a little different idea with bears. There's less sort of direct competition with bears and cougars. What bears really do is they're basically all yogi, looking for a picnic basket and an easy meal. And so they frequently scavenge cougar kills. And this is sort of a good example. So this video is of one of the collared females here in Western Washington. And the area that she's sort of walking along there out along that down tree with all the moss. Up above her is where she had killed a deer. And so you can see her, she's kind of licking her chops and stuff. She had been up there feeding on that deer. And then of course she came down, here into the open area for whatever reason, pretty typical behavior. And you'll see the date on that was August 4th, 2017 at 7:19 in the evening. Oh, about a week later, here's that black bear, right? Same site, kind of like, oh, hey, boo boo, let's get a picnic basket. Now this is a little bear. There was a little more time here, but it's not unusual for bears to show up around day 3 or 4 after a cougar has killed an ungulate and then ultimately usurp that cat. So again, kind of interesting. And there's sort of this evolutionary arms race that's constantly going on in nature. And large carnivores, it's always kind of fun to see just because of what they do and how they do it. All right, let's talk a little bit about population dynamics. I promise there won't be any math here. Overwhelmingly, the size of a cougar population is determined by how much prey is out there on the landscape. Now, cougars do have this feature that we call self-regulation. That is, or not self-regulation, self-limitation. That is, cougars kill other cougars. And so no matter how many prey you have on the landscape, like if you kept dumping them in, there is a ceiling there, but really, for all intents and purposes, the primary driver of the cougar population is how much food there is. Not terribly surprising. That's pretty universal for just about every wildlife population on the planet. Densities do vary in space and time, and they vary throughout Washington. However, they don't vary a whole lot. They seem to sort of operate within a pretty narrow band of densities, and the reason for that is they're a top tier carnivore, and that's not unusual. Unless there are orders of magnitude differences in prey availability, you really wouldn't expect much of a difference in terms of densities out on the landscape. Hands down, human beings are the principal source of mortality for cougar populations. That's, unless you're dealing with an entirely wilderness-based population, which frankly, there's not many of those left anymore. Just about every cougar population is exposed to some level of people, and people are hard on cats. Interestingly, reproduction is as predictable and consistent as anything in cougar ecology and behavior. Litter sizes, without fail, average 2 to 3 kittens about every 2 years. And that really doesn't fluctuate. Interestingly, even with more prey out on the landscape, that's kind of the litter size. But they do, you have dispersal, you have immigration, emigration from places with high survival sources into places with lower survival sinks. Again, I talked a little bit here about the whole kitten thing. I mentioned earlier as well, the dispersal at about 1.5 years. Gestation, 92 days. Cougars do breed throughout the year. I've seen litters in February, I've seen litters in December. However, we do see a birth pulse that occurs in June, July, August, and September. And our belief is that's driven by, there's sort of an advantage to having your kittens in the summer because you have abundant food in the form of deer fawns and elk calves. This is pretty typical dispersal for male cougars. These are 4 different individuals here that were studied as part of my research project. And again, they can get up and go. We've had documented cases of dispersal from cougars in South Dakota, where there's a remnant population in the Black Hills that they had one cat that made it from the Black Hills all the way to Connecticut. They had another one that made it all the way to Louisiana. That's definitely sort of outliers in the extreme, but it does show what they're capable of. Interestingly, all males disperse some distance. It's thought to be in avoiding inbreeding. Females, however, can be what we call philopatric, and they'll set up a home range immediately adjacent or very close to where they were born, mom's home range, or they can also disperse upwards of 400 or 500 kilometers as well. We don't have a great understanding of what sort of drives that. We think it's a function of sort of how stable the social organization is, as well as sort of how much prey there is on the landscape. All right, to sort of kind of wrap this part up, mentioned a lot of this stuff earlier. Use of residential areas is very, very common. This idea of using suitable habitat within the matrix. Something that's kind of interesting is that a growing cougar population doesn't necessarily equate to more overlap or interactions with people. This was a big focus of my research. You'll often hear people talk about, well, we've got more cats overlapping with people because the wildlands are full and they're getting pushed. That's not necessarily true in all circumstances. The landscape really matters. The food that's out there really matters. I mentioned this earlier. It's all about suitable habitat and vulnerable prey that can be exploited by cougars. Also kind of interesting, cougars in these wildland urban landscapes are in fact pretty normal cougars. They do all the things that cougars that live exclusively in wildlands do. They're not strange, they're not odd. They kind of they use the landscape in the same way. They just tend to have a little more tolerance for people and tend to be able to roll with a few more punches. And what this ultimately means is that cougars are actually doing a pretty good job of coexisting. And so when we think about cougar-human interactions, there's a lot of factors that sort of contribute to cougar-human interactions. I've got some of them listed here, but when you think about how much time cougars spend in or near people, in residential areas or near people, and how few conflicts we really have, from my perspective, I think they're doing a reasonably good job of coexisting. Now, with that being said, if you're the person whose goat gets killed, or if you're the hiker that bumps into an angry female with kittens, that probably means a little less to you, right? Like, okay, it's rare, but it happened to me. And so it does, I don't want to downplay that. I don't want to diminish it because it does happen, but by and large, the perception of risk sort of exceeds the actual risk. And I've got some numbers there. I left this in here. I debated whether or not I should, but basically this was actually some of the hard numbers from how many interactions per people per year that we saw in Western Washington. And what you'll see there is that there's really not a lot, basically somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5, 3 interactions per every 100,000 people per year. Most of those were depredations, and most of those were driven by individuals that were involved in multiple depredations. Only about 30% of the cougar population actually interacts with people. So I mentioned earlier that most cats use areas with residential development. Most people, have been in the same place at the same time as a cat. They just haven't been aware of it because the overwhelming majority of cats do a pretty good job of staying away from people. All right, so let's sort of close this out here with some tips for how you can avoid interactions, what you do if in fact you encounter a cougar. One of the big ones is not making your home yard property attractive to cougars, and that's by making it less attractive to prey. So one of the things that we're really encourage people is to not feed wildlife. Do not feed deer and elk. Do not feed raccoons. Feed your pets indoors. Pet food can attract things like coyotes and raccoons, which then can in turn attract cougars. Basically, I always use sort of the explainer that a lot of people like to see deer and elk on their property, near their home, things like that. Probably not if you're a gardener, but there are people that do like seeing deer and elk around their home. But if you are encouraging deer and elk to be near your home, you're indirectly encouraging cougars to be as well. And so those are sort of kind of some straightforward things you can do to sort of diminish the risk of having cougars, on your property, near your home, that sort of thing. Animal husbandry is a big one. Overwhelmingly, in the interactions that we see that involve depredations, the animal husbandry was inadequate for preventing conflicts with cougars. And this is always one that I you know, it's hard because some of the things that you have to do, you know, they can be cost prohibitive. And if folks are, you know, they may not have the resources available, you know, not everyone can build a great big barn with a locking door for their livestock, right? And so that's tough. If you can, great, because one of the best things you can do is board your animals at night. Overwhelmingly, the depredations that we do see tend to occur during the night. They tend to be animals that are left in forested portions or forested areas, or within pastures that are immediately adjacent to forested areas. And the cats get them in the middle of the night. Folks wake up and either the goat is missing, or they find the goat on the edge of the pasture, right? You know, the cat has drug it right up to the fence and cached it, things like that. For that reason, I always, if possible, I encourage people to, you know, build your pasture as far from the forest edge as possible. Remove as much cover. Again, cougars are stalking predators. They make their living not being seen, not being detected. They are not terribly comfortable out in the open, and they're much less successful hunting in the open. And so if you can reduce the cover, you make it less attractive to cougars. You can also use motion sensing lights in the areas that you, where you keep your animals. That can be helpful. There's not a lot of definitive science on the use of guard dogs, but sort of anecdotally, I have seen pretty good evidence that livestock guard dogs can be pretty effective. And so again, this is getting a large dog that you have to feed and take care of is not a small commitment, but if you have the ability to do it, it can reduce your risk. The other sort of big category where we see folks interacting with cougars is not necessarily, you know, in their backyard or at the wildland urban interface. It's when you're in the wildlands, right? Camping, hiking, hunting, fishing, mountain biking, trail running, whatever you do to enjoy the outdoors. When you're doing that, you are in fact in cougar habitat. And so you need to be aware of that, and you need to be prepared. And I think one of the biggest things that I sort of advise folks is just sort of recognize and realize that at any given moment, you could bump into a cougar. Folks think of cougars as being nocturnal. They're not. They are more active at night, but they're in fact very day active as well. They're really sort of, they're very active at night. They're very active at early in the morning, early in the evening. But that doesn't mean they're not active during the day. In fact, on 2 separate occasions, I watched cougars hunt deer in the middle of an August day, 85 degrees and a clear cut. So just because you're in the middle of the day doesn't mean you're not gonna bump into a cat. So anyway, there's just sort of chance favors the prepared mind, and having just sort of the situational awareness and saying to yourself, like, okay, I'm out for a bike ride today. What would I do if I encountered a cougar? What would I do? I mean, just sort of running that scenario through your mind, you're already ahead of the game. When you do recreate, I always encourage people to make lots of noise, do it in groups. If you're with your dog, you know, keep control of your dog, keep your dog close by. It's less of an issue with cougars and more of an issue with bears, where we'll have folks who have a dog off leash, dog gets out ahead of them. Next thing you know, the dog's bringing a bear back to you. We've seen that a couple of times in recent years. Do not approach wildlife, alive or dead, because you don't know if, one, that could be a young animal, you know, it looks like something else from a distance, and then you get up close and then you realize, oh boy, that's a kitten. And if there's a kitten there, mom's pretty close by. She probably just crossed the trail, and the kitten was lagging and you just bumped into the kitten. So don't do that. Dead animal, same thing. That might, you may have stumbled onto an animal that was just killed and the cat is right there. So it's best to avoid that. I mentioned sort of the activity patterns. A lot of folks recreate early in the morning and late in the evening as sort of a reflection of their work schedule, or that just might be when they want to do it. It's not a huge risk. Again, the risk of being attacked by a cougar is exceptionally small. However, if you are trail running or mountain biking early in the morning or in the evening, you are at an elevated risk. And so you need to be aware of that. And then I always encourage folks to carry bear spray. There's lots of different options. This is what I carry when I'm working. I carry it because, one, it's effective. It's really easy to keep with me. It's easy to deploy. I can deploy it quickly. It's $40 a canister. So it's pretty inexpensive. You need to have it on your person. They make chest harnesses, put it on your belt. You don't want to have it in your backpack or buried deep in your pocket. You want it like readily available so that you can get to it as quick as possible. I've got some of the main, manufacturers listed there. All that really matters is you want that minimum 2% capsaicin in terms of the ingredients. Your typical mace that you would see, at like a firearm store or something like that. That's not for cougars and bears. That's a totally different thing. That shoots a little stream. This thing shoots a giant fog cloud 30 to 40 feet out there and stuff. You want the real deal bear stuff. And again, I can't emphasize enough, this is not just for bears. This works for cats. It can work with moose or an angry bull elk or some creepy weird dude that you meet at the trailhead. It works across the board. Kind of giving you an idea here of like sort of assessing risk, because not all situations are created equal, and really the cat will sort of tell you what they're thinking with their facial expressions and their body language. Ears forward, eyes closed, opening and shut. That's a cat that's pretty calm, right? Like that's a cat that's not feeling a lot of stress. If the ears are forward, the eyes are open, the whiskers are forward. It's just basically this picture on the lower left. We call that alert. That's not necessarily a risk. They're just engaged. And then, of course, for any of you that have owned house cats, you kind of know how the general progression of hostility looks, right? Ears back or flat, vocalizations. Often you'll see, the tail thrashing or thumping, and you might even get a full-blown, hiss or snarl. The one thing to keep in mind is if you see that cat start to wiggle their backside or pump their legs, that's a very, very serious situation, and they're getting ready to come forward. And so you need to be prepared. And so in the extremely unlikely event that you were in fact, attacked by a cougar or encounter a cougar, the first and foremost, the thing you need to do is you need to stop, stand tall, and absolutely do not run. Run means chase to a cat. If you have smaller children, you want to pick them up because they are more vulnerable because they're smaller. It's really that simple. This is one a lot of folks don't realize is you don't want to break eye contact. And that's because, again, they're a visual hunter. And by maintaining eye contact, what you're telling them is, I see you. You've lost the element of surprise. This is different than a bear. You do not want to maintain eye contact with a bear. Bears sort of interpret consistent eye contact as sort of like a physical challenge. That's how bear world works, but bear world is different than cougar world. So cougars, don't break eye contact. Sometimes people joke about this. There's a great episode of The Simpsons that has this happen. I won't go on that tailspin, but this whole make yourself as big as possible, and yell and wave your arms, it works. I've had more than my fair shares of face-to-faces with cougars, yelling at them, waving my arms, making myself as large as possible. It can be really effective. And if possible, no one is going to judge you as a bad person if you throw something at a cougar. It's totally understandable. It's totally justifiable. Now, I wouldn't recommend you bend over and pick up stuff to throw at the cougar, but if you've got something on your person or something nearby that you can throw at them, do it. It's all sort of, you got to remember, there's a constant sort of economic calculation going on in their mind, a cost benefit. And you want to swing that equation as far as you can into the cost side of things. And again, in the exceptionally rare circumstances that you are actually attacked, you need to fight back aggressively. Do your best to stay on your feet, poke them in the eyes, you know, whatever you can do. Are you going to be hurt? Yeah, probably. It's a cougar. It's a very large cat. I wrestle with my 15-pound tabby here and usually come out worse for wear. But people that have been attacked by cougars and have fought back, more often than not, they do survive. But I don't want to end on that, because that's a rare event, and that's a sort of a negative idea. The reality is, most of you will never have to be in that situation. And I always like to end with a picture like this, which is sort of the more typical cougar situation near us. I took this photo many years ago. I've got a number of photos like this, but this is a good one. I took this photo on Tiger Mountain. There is, in fact, a cougar in this picture about 30, 40 feet up the hill, staring at me. And I'll give you a moment to kind of figure out where he is. You know, it's funny because I see him right away, but then again, I took the picture, I know. But just so you know, he's right there. And so just to kind of point it out for you here, if I can get my cursor working. See there, that's an eyeball. There's the top of his head, his ears. You see a little bit of his body. That's a pretty typical situation. So with that, again, I probably talked too long, but I'm happy to answer whatever questions you may have. I see there's some stuff in the chat here. I didn't look at that while I was presenting, so I don't know if folks had a question. Nope, those look like comments. Oh wait, I do see a question here. So this is a question from Chris C. Curious about use of subalpine habitat, seasonal changes in habitat use. Also, what about marmots? Do cougars eat marmots? Evidence of interactions with, gotta scroll down here, with wolverines. Okay, so there's a couple questions there. The first one is the use of subalpine habitats, seasonal changes. And the short answer is yes, there are pretty significant seasonal changes. Just given the amount of snow that the Cascade Mountains gets, it's extremely unusual to see a cougar above 35,000, 4,000 feet in the winter on the eastern or western slope of the Cascades. Sometimes they will go up and over the top, you know, of a ridge or a mountain in the middle of winter to get sort of the fastest from one point to the next. But in general, they tend to concentrate at elevations below 3,000 feet. Big part of that is that's what deer and elk do, especially on the eastern slope. They're moving from their high elevation summer ranges down to their low elevation winter ranges, and cougars follow them there. However, in the summertime, cougars are pretty common in those higher elevation subalpine habitats. Typically not above, as I alluded to earlier, 6,500 feet. Sometimes they'll go up to 7, but really 6,500 is kind of the max elevation. Marmots, yes, they eat marmots, especially on the Olympic Peninsula and especially on Vancouver Island. In fact, Vancouver Island marmots are a endangered species, and one of the challenges that they're having with marmot recovery is, in fact, cougar predation. So yes, where marmots are present, cougars do eat them. I did not see that a lot in my Western Washington study area because we don't have marmots in my study area. And then evidence of interactions with wolverines. I have not seen it myself, but yes, wolverines will harass cougars off of kills as well. Wolverines are basically like 45 pounds of dynamite. They harass everything, and so yeah, they will run a cougar off a kill. Not a ton of documentation of that, but that's more a function of the fact that wolverines obviously are pretty rare. So great questions. All right, let's see. Yeah, I'll do my best not to dish math. I'm just being flippant. I do like math. I wish I was better at it. Is there seasonal use of urban interface areas, i.e. winter versus summer? Great question. Not really. So there is sort of an east side, west side difference here. Ungulate populations, deer and elk populations in eastern Washington are much more migratory than black-tailed deer and elk populations along the western slope of the Cascades. That's largely a function of just the differences in climate. Really, in western Washington, black-tailed deer are kind of a sedentary deer. Some do have migratory behavior, but it's not, you don't see the massive migratory movements like you do with mule deer. But at least in my study area, no, winter, summer, it was pretty much the same. On the east side, where you do have some of those seasonal movements, you do see a little more use of residential areas in the wintertime. And again, that's because deer and cougars are concentrated on the ungulate winter range, which is often where people live too, right? In valley bottoms, that sort of thing. Around, so let's see here, around home, will air horns will air horns help in scaring a cougar away? Yes. Yeah, any sort of loud noise. Yeah, I mean, if you were confronted with a cougar and you hit an air horn, I would suspect that, yeah, that could be very effective. Not foolproof, but yeah, there is some value in that. Do you ever hear of cougars attacking horses? Yes, it's not terribly common. It varies from place to place. It's almost always smaller horses, foals, that sort of thing. It tends to be very localized, and what it is it's driven by individual cougars that may, for whatever reason, have decided to go after horses and figured out they can do it. But again, it's attacks on adult horses are, in 20 years, I've seen 2. Now, granted, I was in a place where probably there's not a lot of, just the way that folks sort of have their horses in Western Washington may be different than what they have in Eastern Washington. I mean, you don't get a lot of ranches in Western Washington and stuff like that. So certainly horses in an Eastern Washington landscape might be more at risk, but it's still pretty uncommon, especially, I mean, a full-grown horse is a pretty formidable animal. I mean, at least in terms of visually, it's very large. Without a doubt, horses are the ones that in terms of like when we get reports of species that have been suspected of being attacked by a cougar, overwhelmingly horses tend to be the least frequently confirmed. That is, people suspect a cougar and almost always, or it's not. You know, oftentimes it's an injury from some other thing. But again, it's not a zero risk. Oh, okay. So kind of keeping on the horse theme here. I have horses that run in stalls but are not locked in at night. I've heard of cougars attacking horses. What can you share about that? Yeah, I mean, the hard part is, again, so you know, cougar attacks on horses, they can happen, but they are rare. In my experience, so tough is, and you'll have to forgive me, I'm not an expert on horses and things like that, so this is just sort of based on my experiences, is they're such a muscular animal with really thin skin that, sometimes, they'll bump up against a fence post, or, bump up against a trailer in the corral or in the stall and stuff. And they can get the most gruesome injuries that look like they were attacked by a cougar or another carnivore, when in fact it was just an accident. And often you'll hear folks say, well, the cat had claw marks on its back end or on its back. And that's not really how cougars do things. They tend to attack the head and the neck. That's how they go after their prey. And so we really wouldn't expect, wounds on the upper back or the backside, or even on the legs. That's the one that we hear about a lot. It's like, oh, it's got wounds on its legs. It was a cougar, when in fact that's probably the last place a cat would go after. But in terms of spooking them and stuff, gosh, it could happen. I don't have a lot of direct experience in that. I mean, I've heard stories and things like that, but there's not a whole lot more I could probably offer there. Let's see, keep going here. How can I get a copy of the white papers that you displayed at the beginning of your talk? Oh, those are publications. I can send them to you. You can just look me up, or ask Jan for my email, and I'd be more than happy to send you copies of papers that I've written. They're excellent bedtime material if you're an insomniac. Might help put you out pretty quick, but yeah, I do have copies of those.
Brian,
sure. Yes,
Brian, this is Larry Stauffer. I'm the one that asked.
Oh, okay.
I've got a couple of papers from Gary Kohler from Fish and Wildlife, but they were pretty limited, and I don't know if there's been new production over the past 5 years or so, but I would like to get whatever you've got. Quite frankly, I'm kind of I'm really interested in reading that type of stuff. Who do I talk to get that?
You could talk to me. I've got all that stuff, not just the stuff that I've done. So yeah. So
how do I contact you?
I'll ask Jan. Does Jan or someone have your email? And
I'm not sure. I provided an email this morning, but I don't know if Jan knows who I am. So.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll circle back here, but okay. Yeah. And so for folks that don't know, Gary Kohler is my predecessor. Gary Kohler was the carnivore researcher for WDFW. He was the principal investigator on Project Cat in Cleelum. And but Gary retired back in 2010. I got his job in February 2012. It sat vacant for a while, and then I was the fortunate soul to take that on. But yeah, there's been a lot of work done since Gary hung it up. We probably have 30 peer-reviewed publications dealing with cougars here in Washington and stuff. So yeah, there's definitely probably something there that could scratch just about any itch you have, and happy to share what I can. Yeah. So all right, so moving along here. Okay, interesting question here. So a question about the geographic maps of cougar range in North and South America. And it appeared that there was a northern limit, far northern Canada and Alaska. Why is this, as caribou and moose are available prey? So I don't really know. Some of that, I mean, it's probably, a climate thing. It could be, the winters are just a little too cold, but then, God, winters in southern Alaska really aren't any colder than they are in, say, Montana or Wyoming. That's a great question, and one that I don't know if anybody's ever looked at that. I will tell you this, with climate change, cougars are probably one of the few species that are going to be just fine with climate change. And in fact, you are seeing cougars starting to show up in Southeast Alaska now. It's still unusual, but there does appear to be some range expansion. I will say this, caribou and definitely moose, a Yukon moose and Alaska moose is a much, much bigger moose than what you get down here in the lower 48 and here in Washington. So here, when I'm talking about cougars killing cow moose, that's a 600-pound animal, probably closer to 400 pounds if it's a cow. I mean, moose in Alaska, you're talking over 1,000 pounds, and that's just too big for a cougar. I can't speak as much about the size of caribou, but I suspect that you're kind of at the upper end of suitable prey. Now, with that being said, Alaska has black-tailed deer, and black-tailed deer are within range, but why cougars aren't necessarily in those areas, I don't have a good answer for that. Congratulations on stumping me. That's a good one. If I hike alone, in your opinion, is it foolish to bring a Labrador type dog with me off leash? Okay. As the proud owner of a Labrador, you probably saw my door swing open partially through the talk or heard it. That was said Labrador retriever, checking out what I was up to. I recreate all the time by myself with my Labrador. I don't think you're foolish, and I am guilty of having my Labrador off leash. Is it smarter to keep them on leash and close by? Absolutely. And certainly that's the better way to go. I mean, really what you want them is you want them close. You just don't want them wandering off into the brush or out ahead of you on the trail where you can't see them and stuff like that and stuff. So no, I don't think you're foolish. I think you're probably my kindred spirit. But again, a lot of this is sort of a function of, being aware and telling yourself, okay, well, what would I do if I encountered this situation and stuff. But with all that being said, yeah, if they're on leash, that is the smarter, more responsible thing to do. Let's see. How do they shelter and hunt with heavy snowfall? Yeah. So obviously you guys got quite the dumping here recently. So yeah, what cats usually do is they usually during heavy snow events or even a rainstorm, pretty typical for them to sort of just nestle up against the base of a tree, and which can be shockingly dry. You find a lot of day beds at the base of trees, that sort of thing. Rock outcroppings, stuff like that. Anything that will get them out of the weather, they will definitely do that. They're no different than any other animal, like that heavy snow event that you guys got where you got 3+ feet of snow. That's a real challenge for them to move around in. With that being said, it's much more of a challenge for deer and elk to move in that sort of situation. So in fact, winter is a pretty good time of year to be a cougar. Winter tends to be more of a miserable time of year for deer and elk because of coming out of the rut and sort of the energetic expenses there. It's hard to find food. It's you're burning through your fat reserves. Not the case with cougars, wolves. Winter tends to be a season of bounty because your primary food source is much more vulnerable. All right, moving along here. You guys have great questions. Yeah, so with Monique there just talking about fear and that sort of thing. Yeah, so the way I think about it, when talking about cougars and thinking about, I think it's normal and it's totally understandable when people say, "Hey, I'm afraid of cougars. I'm scared. They scare me." Yeah, we all sort of come by that naturally, right? large round eyes on the front of the face, big teeth, sharp claws, like that's always sort of freaked us out. That's something that's sort of imprinted sort of deep into us. But you shouldn't let fear or an irrational fear sort of guide your behavior. The way I think about it is when you're out there and you might encounter these guys, it's sort of it's extremely unlikely that anything is really ever going to happen, but really information and knowledge is power, and sort of knowing what to do and understanding how to interpret behavior and stuff, that can go a long way. I mean, from my perspective, I've had lots of face-to-face encounters with cougars. More, I could spend the next 3 hours telling you guys stories. And it's, that knowledge has always sort of helped me act and think rationally in those moments. And really for me, it's about, I'm not necessarily afraid of them, but I very much respect them, what they are and what they're capable of doing. And it is sort of constantly processing the information that comes, that's sort of being presented to you and stuff. And so, yeah, so it's a normal thing to feel fear, but I think that the education and understanding can help you get past that fear and get you to that place of, knowledge-driven action, if we'll think about it that way. So let's see here. What else we got here? What is dominant, jaguars or cougars? In the places where they overlap, jaguars are thought to be dominant. Jaguars are much bigger. So this is going to be fun for you on trivia night. There's something called Bergmann's rule or Bergmann's law, if you've never heard of it. And basically what that means is an animal that's distributed quite widely along a latitudinal gradient, the further you get away from the equator, the larger the species becomes. Now that applies both within species and across species. Animals at the equator tend to be smaller than animals at the Arctic and subarctic. And it's all about, that surface to volume ratio and sort of regulating body temperature. So cougars or pumas at the equator and in those sort of surrounding landscapes actually are quite a bit smaller than what we have here in Washington and sort of the northern latitudes of North America. And then of course, pumas that you find in Chile and Argentina. But jaguars are pretty big. Jaguars are pretty big. I once heard them described as a fire hydrant with legs, which if jaguars have the most powerful bite of all of the big cats. And in fact, one of the most powerful bites out of any animal on the planet. So yeah, jaguars are thought to be dominant. And then Lorna. Hey, Lorna. Can you remind people that bear spray can be used if a bear or cat attacks a pet while out hiking? Spray them both. They will both survive. Yeah, I can't. So we talked a little bit about the bear spray and things like that. It really is effective. And the idea with the bear spray is that it's effective. It will, can end the aggressive behavior of a cougar or a bear. They're going to be uncomfortable. They're going to experience some pain, but they will survive. And so it's sort of seen as a win-win for everybody. But yeah, I mean, if you got it, if a cat goes after your dog or a bear goes after your dog, hit them both. Yeah, your pup it's not going to be your pup's best day. But you get them home, get them into the bathtub, rinse those membranes, particularly the eyes and the nose and the mouth. And I have in fact experienced the joy of bear spray myself, not intentionally. I can attest to the discomfort. I can also attest to the fact that it does go away and it doesn't last forever. So cool. All right. Well, I think I made it through the questions in the chat. If anybody else has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and I'm happy to answer them, although it is It is getting later in the evening. As I warned you, you do not have to antagonize me to talk about these animals. And so I have a tendency to go. So let's see, I got another one up here in the chat, it looks like. No, well, thank you. Well, thank you for attending and listening to me go on and on about these guys. So yeah.
Brian, Brian, what's the story with that cat in the last photo?
Oh, this guy. So he was, yeah, the guy in the last photo here, he was a cat that he did, in fact, he got into some goats, and so we captured him and put a collar on him and moved him. We translocated him, or we relocated him from the site, and then we released him. But prior to releasing him, we set up a bunch of GoPros and cameras, and so this was him right after he came out of the trap, and because we transport him with like a culvert trap like you use for bears, and so you basically just open the door and off they go. And so anyway, that was just that was one of the pictures that we were fortunate enough to get and stuff like that. And so we have moved cats in the past, and it's very situation specific, and he was one that we decided to do it. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian. I want to also congratulate you and thank you for a great presentation. It was obviously very popular based on the number of attendees, and everyone was engaged. A lot of good questions. I think you answered everybody, and we really enjoyed it, and I want to thank you. And I would remind everyone that if you have other questions for Brian, or you want to get a copy of his papers, you can contact Kittitas Audubon at Kittitas Audubon, all one word, at hotmail.com, and we can give you Brian's email that way, so that you can have direct contact with him. So
Yeah, and I would mention as well that as a state employee, you can find my email. The directory is, yeah, if you go into WDFW, you see my name on the screen there and stuff. You should be able to find me.
okay. Well, thank you again, Brian. You know, I spent my career in the natural resources in Idaho and Washington, and I always wanted to see a cougar, and I never have. I've had them actually have their footprints in my footprints when I get back to my truck, but I have never seen a cougar. So
Yeah.
I still hope to sometime. So.
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
Right. Well, we appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to stop the recording, and we will make that available